Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story is of Erik Erikson, a seeker of shadows, who dared to map the hidden continents of the mind through the unfolding stages of a human life. Relax as we explore the life and work of Erik Erikson, a man born without a name, who gave us the language of identity itself, someone who explored the mind, discovering the architecture of the self as it builds itself, crisis by crisis, across the vast span of a lifetime, uncovering how culture and psyche dance together in the formation of who we become. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychology and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the landscape of the soul. Tell me in the comments what draws you most: the mystery of dreams, the spark of emotion, the labyrinth of thought, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the life and work of Erik Erikson as we wander the corridors of the unconscious and listen to the whispering mind beneath the mind. In the year 1902, in the city of Frankfurt, Germany, a child came into the world carrying a secret that would shape his entire understanding of identity. The infant was given the name Erik Salomonsen, after his mother's first husband, but this was a careful fiction. The man whose name he bore had left before his birth, disappearing into that vast category of absence that marks so many lives. The child's biological father was a man his mother never named, a Danish photographer who vanished before Erik could draw his first breath. And so, the boy who would one day give the world the concept of identity crisis began his life in the shadow of an identity that did not quite fit, wearing a name that was not quite his. His mother, Carla Abrahamsen, was a young Jewish woman from a prominent Danish family. She had married a stockbroker named Valdemar Salomonsen, but the marriage dissolved, and soon after, she found herself pregnant by another man. In the moral geography of early 20th century Europe, this was a landscape fraught with shame and silence. She fled to Frankfurt to give birth away from the judging eyes of Copenhagen society. There, in a foreign city, amid the clattering of horse-drawn carriages and the smoke of industrial chimneys, she brought Erik into the world alone. For the first 3 years of his life, Erik knew only his mother. She raised him in a small apartment, the two of them a universe unto themselves. Imagine the quality of that attachment, the intensity of that bond between a mother and a son when they are each other's only anchor in an uncertain world. The developmental psychologists would later speak of attachment styles, of the dance between caregiver and child, but Erik lived it before he could name it. Those early years imprinted something deep in him, a sense perhaps of both profound connection and equally profound uncertainty. When Erik was 3 years old, his mother took him to see a pediatrician named Theodor Homburger. Dr. Homburger was also Jewish, a cultivated man with a thriving medical practice. He examined the young boy with gentle hands, and something passed between the doctor and the young mother. Before long, Carla and Theodor married, and the doctor became the only father Erik would know. Theodor Homburger legally adopted the boy, and Erik became Erik Homburger, taking on yet another name, another identity laid over the first like a palimpsest of selves. The Homburger household was comfortable, cultivated, observant of Jewish traditions. Theodor was kind to Erik, raising him as his own. They had 2 daughters together, Erik's half-sisters, and the family seemed, from the outside, complete. But secrets have a way of seeping through the floorboards of even the most carefully constructed households. Erik was not told the front truth of his origins, not immediately. He grew up in a German Jewish community, attending synagogue, learning Hebrew, absorbing the culture and rituals of a people who had learned to thrive in the margins of European society. But Erik did not look like the other Jewish children. He was tall, blond, blue-eyed. His Nordic features marked him as different in the temple. The other children called him Goy, a Gentile, teasing him for his un-Jewish appearance. Then, when he attended German school, the Christian children marked him as Jewish, an outsider there as well. He belonged fully to neither world, accepted completely by neither community. He was too Jewish for the Germans, too German for the Jews. This experience of being perpetually between identities, of being marked as other from multiple directions, settled into his bones like a chronic ache. Imagine what this does to a developing mind, to a forming sense of self. The question, who am I, was not an abstract philosophical puzzle for Erich Homburger, but a daily, lived confusion. When he finally learned the truth that Theodore was not his biological father, that he had been conceived in a relationship his mother would not discuss, the ground beneath his identity shifted once more. The name he carried was an adopted one. The face in the mirror seemed to belong to a different people than the family around the dinner table. And the silent absence of his biological father became a question mark at the center of his being. This is where Erik Erikson's psychology was born, not in a lecture hall or a consulting room, but in the lived experience of fragmented identity, in the feeling of being a stranger to oneself. The ideas that will later become his 8 stages of psychosocial development, his concept of identity crisis, his understanding of how culture and society shape the individual psyche, all grew from this soil of personal uncertainty. He spent his life trying to understand how a coherent self emerges from the chaos of conflicting influences, how we become who we are despite and because of the confusions of our origins. Erik did not find his path easily. As a young man, he drifted. He completed his gymnasium education, the rigorous German secondary school that prepared students for university, but he did not immediately pursue higher learning. He was restless, uncertain, filled with a vague artistic yearning that had no clear direction. His stepfather hoped he might become a physician, following in Theodore's footsteps, but Erik felt no calling toward medicine. Instead, he announced he would become an artist. In 1920, at the age of 18, Erik left home and began to wander. This was not uncommon for young people of his generation, particularly those with artistic sensibilities. There was even a term for it, wanderschaft, a period of journeying and learning through experience. For some years, Erik traveled through Germany and Italy, a bohemian youth with a sketchbook, supporting himself with odd jobs, sleeping in cheap rooms, studying art informally, growing his hair long, living on the margins of respectability. He enrolled briefly in art school, spending time in Karlsruhe and Munich, learning to draw and paint, but he never fully committed. He was talented but not driven, interested but not passionate. The art of that era was exploding into modernism, expressionism, Dadaism, all the fragmented styles that seemed to mirror the fragmentation of post-war Europe. But Erik painted in a more traditional style, drawn to portraiture, to the human face, to the question of what makes a person recognizable as themselves. Even in his art, he was circling around the question of identity. He read voraciously during these years, philosophy, psychology, literature. He was drawn to Freud, whose ideas were percolating through German intellectual culture like a slow earthquake. The notion that beneath the surface of civilized consciousness lay hidden desires, repressed memories, a whole underworld of the psyche, resonated with Erik's sense of carrying secrets, of living between surfaces. He read Nietzsche's Meditations on Becoming Who You Are. He encountered existential philosophy, with its emphasis on authenticity and self-creation. All of these ideas were seeds that would later flower in his work. The Germany of the 1920s was a place of tremendous cultural ferment and deep political instability. The Weimar Republic was a brilliant, fragile experiment in democracy, a hothouse of art, science, philosophy, and decadence. But beneath it ran currents of resentment, economic chaos, and rising extremism. Erik moved through this landscape as an observer, not deeply political, but absorbing the zeitgeist, feeling the tensions of a society trying to rebuild itself after the catastrophe of the First World War. During these wandering years, Erik lived the archetype of what he would later theorize as the moratorium, a period of exploration and delay between childhood and adulthood, a time when a young person tries on different identities without yet committing to a final form. This concept would become central to his understanding of adolescence. He would write about how modern society increasingly required young people to undergo this transitional phase, this time of identity diffusion and experimentation, before solidifying into adult roles. He lived it first and understood it later. By his mid-20s, Erik had returned to Karlsruhe, still not settled into any career. He was teaching art part-time, painting portraits to earn money, still living on the edges of bourgeois society, neither fully in nor fully out. His stepfather and mother worried. Jewish families valued education, stability, professional accomplishment. Erik seemed adrift. But sometimes drifting is its own form of preparation, a way of staying open until the right door appears. That door appeared in 1927, when Erik was 25 years old. Through a friend, he was invited to Vienna to teach art at a small progressive school. This was no ordinary school. It had been founded by Anna Freud, the youngest daughter of Sigmund Freud himself, and it served the children of the families who had gathered around the father of psychoanalysis. The school was called the Hietzing School, and its students were the children of analysts, of the intellectual elite who were revolutionizing the understanding of the human mind. Vienna in the late 1920s was the capital of psychoanalysis, even as the Austro-Hungarian Empire it had once governed had crumbled into ruins. The city was shabby, economically depressed, politically tense, but it remained a glittering intellectual center. The coffeehouse culture thrived, places where writers, scientists, artists, and revolutionaries argued over cups of melange until the early hours. The Vienna circle of logical positivists met to discuss philosophy and language. In an apartment at Berggasse 19, Sigmund Freud saw patients and wrote the works that were reshaping modern thought. Erik arrived in this world as an outsider, an art teacher with no formal training in anything except his own wandering education. But Anna Freud saw something in him. He was good with children, warm, intuitive, observant. He had an artist's eye for detail and nuance, and he was interested in learning. Anna, who was developing her own theories about child psychology and defense mechanisms, invited Erik to become not just a teacher, but also a student. She offered to train him as a psychoanalyst. This was an extraordinary opportunity. Psychoanalysis was still a relatively closed circle, a discipline that trained its practitioners through personal analysis and supervision rather than formal academic programs. To be invited into this circle was to be granted access to a revolutionary way of thinking about human nature. Erik accepted. He began his personal analysis with Anna Freud herself, lying on the couch several times a week, unraveling the threads of his own identity confusion under her careful attention. Anna Freud was different from her formidable father. Where Sigmund was grand, theoretical, concerned with the vast architecture of the unconscious, Anna was practical, focused, deeply interested in the ego and its defenses, in how children develop. She had written The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, a book that shifted psychoanalytic attention from the id's drives to the ego's strategies for managing reality. She believed that a healthy ego was not one that simply released unconscious wishes, but one that could mediate between inner desires and outer demands, between what we want and what the world requires of us. This emphasis on the ego would profoundly shape Erik's thinking. While classical Freudian theory focused on the unconscious, on the libido, on the Oedipal drama, Erik became interested in the conscious sense of self, in identity as something actively constructed through interactions with the social world. He absorbed Anna's focus on development across childhood, on the ego's increasing competence and adaptive capacity, and he combined this with his own experiences of identity confusion, cultural displacement, and the search for a coherent self. He also met other members of the psychoanalytic circle. He encountered August Ahorn, who worked with delinquent youth and understood how social environment shaped psychological development. He read Helene Deutsch's work on the psychology of women. He was exposed to Otto Rank's ideas about birth trauma and the artist's personality, and he absorbed the general atmosphere of intellectual daring, the sense that they were all engaged in a project of uncovering the hidden laws of human nature. Erik flourished in Vienna. He trained as a Montessori teacher, learning Maria Montessori's methods of child-centered education, observing how children learn through exploration and mastery of their environment. He taught at the Hietzing School, becoming beloved by his students, creating an atmosphere where art was not just about producing objects, but about self-expression and discovery. And he continued his own analysis, diving deeper into the question of who he was. During this time, Erik met a young Canadian-American woman named Joan Mowat Serson. Joan had come to Vienna to teach dance at the Hietzing School, another member of the progressive education experiment. She was intelligent, independent, from a well-to-do Protestant family in Toronto, with a keen interest in art and ideas. Erik was drawn to her immediately. They began a courtship, walking through the streets of Vienna, talking about psychology and culture and the future. In 1930, Erik and Joan married. It was a significant choice in several ways. Joan was not Jewish, and their marriage marked Erik's movement away from Jewish identity and toward a more cosmopolitan, international sense of self. Joan would become his life partner in every sense, an intellectual collaborator, an editor, a co-thinker. She pushed him to write more clearly, to articulate his ideas in accessible language, to think about how psychoanalytic insights could speak to broader cultural and educational questions. Their marriage was a partnership of equals, and Joan's influence on Erik's work cannot be overstated, though it often went unacknowledged in a field dominated by men. They had their first child in Vienna, a son named Kai. The experience of fatherhood added another dimension to Erik's understanding of development. He watched Kai grow day by day, observed the infant's attachment to Joan, the emergence of a personality, the first social interactions. The abstract theories of psychoanalysis became embodied in this small, growing person. Erik began to think about development not just as a series of psychosexual stages, as Freud had outlined, but as a more complex process involving relationship, culture, and identity formation. But Vienna was becoming dangerous. The rise of fascism was no longer a distant political rumor, but a present threat. Anti-Semitic sentiment was growing more violent and explicit. Erik, despite his Nordic appearance, had a Jewish stepfather and was associated with the Freudian circle, which was prominently Jewish and increasingly targeted. In 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany. The writing was on the wall. Many members of the psychoanalytic community began to scatter, seeking safety in other countries. Erik and Joan decided to emigrate. They chose America, the New World, a place where identities could be reinvented, where one's origins might matter less than one's abilities. In 1933, they packed their belongings and sailed west, leaving behind the collapsing grandeur of European civilization for the uncertain promise of the United States. It was during this transatlantic crossing, or shortly after arriving in America, that Erik made one of the most symbolically significant decisions of his life. He changed his name. He dropped the surname Hamburger, the name of his adoptive stepfather, and became Erik Erikson. Erik, son of Erik. He invented his own patronymic, claiming himself as his own father, authoring his own identity. This was more than a bureaucratic change. It was an act of self-creation, a deliberate assertion of autonomy. In refusing both his absent biological father's unknown name and his adoptive father's given name, Erik claimed the right to name himself. The immigrant experience often involves such reinventions, the shedding of old-world identities, the adoption of new-world names. But Erik's self-naming carried an additional layer of psychological meaning. He was enacting the very process he would spend his career theorizing. The construction of identity through active choice rather than passive inheritance. Some have noted the irony that Erikson sounded more generically American or Scandinavian, less obviously Jewish, in a country where anti-Semitism, though less virulent than in Europe, still existed. The name change offered a kind of camouflage, a way to move more easily through American society. But it was also a statement of independence, a declaration that he would define himself rather than be defined by circumstances of birth. Erik Erikson, twice named, thrice named, finally settled into an identity of his own making. The Erikson family initially settled in Boston, where the psychoanalytic community was small but growing. Erik established a private practice, one of the first child psychoanalysts in the city. This was pioneering work. Child psychoanalysis was still in its infancy as a specialization, and most Americans had barely heard of Freud, let alone accepted psychoanalytic ideas. Erik had to build his practice from scratch, explaining to skeptical parents how talking to their children about feelings and fantasies could help with behavioral and emotional problems. He was also appointed to a position at the Harvard Medical School, though he had no medical degree and no undergraduate college degree of any kind. His credentials were his training with Anna Freud and his Montessori certificate, an informal education, but one that carried weight in the still flexible field of psychoanalysis. At Harvard, He worked at the psychological clinic and began to collaborate with researchers studying child development. It was during these early American years that Erik began to formulate his own distinctive approach to development. He was moving away from strict Freudian orthodoxy, though he always maintained respect for Freud's foundational insights. Where Freud focused on psychosexual stages and the unconscious drives, Erik became interested in psychosocial stages and the conscious search for identity. Where Freud emphasized the conflicts between instinct and civilization, Erik emphasized the ego's adaptive capacities and its embeddedness in culture. One of his early insights came from working with children of different social classes and ethnic backgrounds in Boston. He noticed that the psychological conflicts children experienced were not universal and timeless, but were shaped by their social context. A child from a wealthy Brahmin family faced different pressures and developed different ego strengths than a child from an Irish immigrant family or an Italian-American community. The healthy personality in one context might be maladaptive in another. Development, Erik realized, was not just a biological unfolding, but a cultural process, a negotiation between individual capacity and social expectation. This insight was deepened by an unexpected opportunity. In 1938, Erik was invited to accompany an anthropologist, Scudder McKeel, to a Sioux reservation in South Dakota. McKeel was studying the Pine Ridge Reservation, and he wanted a psychological perspective on the cultural changes and social problems the Sioux were facing. Erik accepted, bringing his psychoanalytic eye to a context radically different from the Vienna consulting room. The Pine Ridge Reservation in the late 1930s was a place of profound cultural dislocation. The Lakota Sioux who lived there had, within living memory, been free-ranging buffalo hunters who dominated the northern plains. Now they were confined to reservation land, their traditional economy destroyed, their children sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their language or practicing their traditions, their social structure undermined by federal policies designed to force assimilation into white American culture. Erik arrived with Joan and their young children, and he began to observe and listen. He met with families, spoke with elders, watched children play. He was particularly interested in child-rearing practices and how Sioux culture shaped personality development. What he found challenged his existing frameworks. Sioux child-rearing, he discovered, was profoundly different from European American models. Sioux mothers were nurturing and generous with their infants, nursing them for extended periods, responding immediately to their cries, rarely frustrating their needs. There was no emphasis on early toilet training or imposed schedules, practices that Freud had argued were crucial sites of psychosexual conflict and personality formation. Instead, there was an extended period of what Erik would call basic trust, a phase where the infant experienced the world as abundant and responsive. But this generosity in infancy gave way to a different set of expectations. As children grew, Sioux culture valued autonomy, bravery, generosity, and skill. Children were expected to master the tasks of their gender roles without excessive direct instruction. They learned through observation, imitation, and play. There was emphasis on not showing fear or pain, on maintaining dignity in the face of hardship, on sharing resources with the community rather than accumulating personal wealth. The problem was that these traditional values were now in conflict with the realities of reservation life. The bravery and hunting skills that had been adaptive in the buffalo days were no longer relevant. The generosity and communal sharing that had sustained tribal life were interpreted by white administrators as laziness or lack of ambition. Children educated in boarding schools learned to value individual achievement and accumulation. Coming back to the reservation, alienated from their elders, trapped between two worlds, Erik saw in the Sioux a living example of what he was coming to call identity confusion. The young people especially were caught between incompatible identity systems. They could not fully be traditional Sioux warriors because that world no longer existed, but they were also not accepted as full citizens in white American society. They suffered from what he would later term historical dislocation, a collective identity crisis caused by rapid, forced cultural change. From his time with the Sioux, Erik developed several key insights. First, that identity is not just personal, but cultural. That who we are is always a we as much as an I. That our sense of self is embedded in a community's sense of itself. Second, that different cultures organize development around different virtues and crises. That there is no universal model of the healthy personality apart from its cultural context. And third, that the disruption of cultural continuity creates psychological pathology, that human beings need a coherent narrative, linking past, present, and future to develop a stable identity. He would later write about these observations in a book called Childhood and Society, describing his time with the Sioux with empathy and respect, though also with the limitations of his position as an outsider. Some Native American scholars would later critique his work for interpreting indigenous experience through a psychoanalytic lens that remained fundamentally European. But Erik's willingness to learn from cultures different from his own, to question his assumptions, and to see development as culturally embedded rather than biologically determined, marked a significant expansion of psychoanalytic thinking. After his work with the Sioux, Erik conducted a similar study with the Yurok people of Northern California, a fishing culture with very different child-rearing practices and values. The Yurok emphasized frugality, the careful conservation of resources, the importance of ritual purification, and proper behavior to maintain cosmic balance. Again, Erik saw how culture shaped personality, how the individual's psyche was molded by, and in turn maintained, the collective worldview. These anthropological experiences fundamentally altered Erik's approach to psychology. He became convinced that any theory of human development had to account for cultural variation, that the ego was not just managing instinctual drives, but was negotiating a place within a cultural world. That identity was as much a social as an individual phenomenon. While Erik was developing these insights through his clinical work and anthropological studies, he was also beginning to formulate his most influential contribution to psychology, the 8 stages of psychosocial development. This framework would become his lasting legacy, a map of human growth from infancy to old age that remains embedded in textbooks, therapy practices, educational curricula, and popular understanding. The concept grew gradually, built on multiple foundations. There was Freud's original schema of psychosexual stages, which Erik learned in Vienna, but found too narrowly focused on bodily zones and libidinal energy. There was the influence of Anna Freud and ego psychology, with its emphasis on the ego's adaptive functions and relationship to reality. There was his observation of his own children growing, his clinical work with troubled young people, his anthropological studies of different cultures, and his lifelong personal struggle with identity. All of these streams flowed together into a comprehensive theory. What made Erik's model revolutionary was its scope and its emphasis. Unlike Freud, who focused mostly on early childhood and ended development with the resolution of the Oedipus complex around age 5 or 6, Erik extended development across the entire lifespan, from birth to death. He proposed that human beings continue to grow, to face new challenges, to develop new capacities throughout their lives. This was a radically optimistic view, suggesting that we are never finished, never fixed in some final form established in early childhood. Each of Erik's 8 stages revolves around what he called a crisis, though he used the term not to mean catastrophe, but rather a turning point, a moment of decision and potential change. The German word he had in mind was something closer to crossroads or critical period. At each stage of life, the individual faces a central conflict between 2 opposing tendencies, and the way this conflict is resolved shapes the ego's ongoing development. Crucially, Erik did not see these conflicts as all or nothing, win or lose propositions. The goal was not to fully embrace one pole and reject the other, but to integrate them in a ratio that favored the positive tendency while still acknowledging the realistic necessity of the negative. For example, in the first stage, the conflict is between trust and mistrust. A healthy infant does not develop pure, naive trust. Rather, the child develops a fundamental sense that the world is reliable and caregivers are dependable, but also retains enough mistrust to be appropriately cautious. It is this balance, weighted toward trust but including realistic wariness, that produces the ego strength Erik called hope. Each successfully navigated stage, according to Erik's theory, results in the development of a virtue or ego strength, a capacity that enriches the personality and prepares one for subsequent challenges. These virtues accumulate over a lifetime, building a mature ego capable of intimacy, productivity, and wisdom. But each stage also has its dangers. If the crisis is poorly resolved, if the negative pole predominates, the individual develops a core weakness or pathology that affects all subsequent development. Erik called this process epigenetic, borrowing a term from embryology. The epigenetic principle states that development proceeds according to a predetermined ground plan, that each capacity emerges at its appointed time in a sequence that builds on what came before. Just as the embryo develops organs in a specific order, the neural tube before the limbs before the fingers, the psyche develops capacities in sequence. Each stage has its proper time, and each depends on the adequate resolution of earlier stages. You cannot develop generativity in midlife if you never developed industry in childhood. The architecture of the self is cumulative, but unlike physical embryology, psychosocial development is not purely biological. It unfolds through interaction with the environment, especially the social and cultural environment. The infant's capacity to develop trust depends on having caregivers who are reliably responsive. The adolescent's formation of identity depends on having a culture that provides clear roles and rituals of transition. The older adult's achievement of integrity depends on living in a society that respects the elderly and sees the life cycle as meaningful. Development, in Erik's view, is always a co-production of individual readiness and social facilitation. Let us walk slowly through each of Erik's 8 stages, lingering in them, exploring the textures of each life phase, understanding the crises and virtues that shape a human being from first breath to last. The journey of the self begins in utter helplessness. The newborn infant is perhaps the most vulnerable creature in nature, unable to regulate body temperature, incapable of locomotion, entirely dependent on others for every need. The first year of life is therefore a time of total reliance on caregivers, and the central psychological task is to develop a sense of whether the world is a place that can be trusted to meet one's needs. An infant cries, and in that cry is a kind of primordial question. Will someone come? The baby is hungry, wet, cold, frightened, lonely, and has no capacity to self-soothe or self-provide. When a caregiver responds promptly and appropriately, when the breast or bottle appears and the hunger is sated, when the wet diaper is changed and comfort returns, when the baby is held and the fear subsides, something is established in the infant's experience. A pattern forms. The world, though sometimes uncomfortable, can be counted on. Others exist who care. Needs, when expressed, lead to satisfaction. This is the foundation of what Erik called basic trust. It is not a cognitive belief the infant has no concepts yet, no language, no ability to think, I trust. Rather, it is a felt sense, an embodied certainty that existence is more benign than hostile, that the environment is more predictable than chaotic, that the self is held in a network of reliable relationships. Freud had called this period the oral stage, focusing on the mouth as the locus of pleasure and the main way the infant relates to the world. Erik accepted this, but expanded the lens. Yes, feeding is central to infancy, but the psychological significance is not just about oral gratification. It is about the quality of the relationship. A baby might be fed on schedule, but still develop mistrust if the feeding is mechanical, if the caregiver is anxious or resentful, if the broader emotional atmosphere is cold. Conversely, a baby might experience some hunger or delay, but still develop trust if the overall pattern is one of responsive care. Erik emphasized that trust develops not from perfect satisfaction of needs, but from consistent, predictable, and loving care. The good enough mother, as the pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott would later phrase it, is sufficient. It is the reliability that matters, the sense that the infant's signals are understood and mostly met, that there is a rhythm to care, that the world has a pattern. The first year also includes, inevitably, experiences of frustration, discomfort, and abandonment. The mother must leave the room. Hunger grows before food arrives. Discomfort persists. Pain occurs. These experiences plant the seeds of mistrust, the recognition that the world is not always responsive, that needs are not always met, that the self is sometimes alone and helpless. This mistrust is necessary. It is the beginning of reality testing, of distinguishing between the idealized world of perfect care and the actual world of limits and delays. The healthy outcome of this first stage is a balance in which trust predominates, but mistrust is present as realism. The infant develops what Erik called the virtue of hope. Hope is the first ego strength, the foundational capacity to believe that even when things are difficult, relief will come, that wishes can be fulfilled, that existence is worth continuing. Hope is the opposite of despair. It is the infant's first act of faith, the beginning of a relationship with the future. But if care is grossly inconsistent, neglectful, or abusive, if the infant's cries too often go unanswered, if hunger persists too long, if touch is harsh or absent, then mistrust predominates. The world is experienced as unreliable, dangerous, indifferent. Such an infant may become withdrawn, unresponsive, failing to thrive. Or the child may develop what Erik described as a withdrawal into self, a primitive defense where the infant tries to minimize need, to not reach out because reaching out has proven futile or dangerous. This early failure to develop basic trust reverberates through all later stages, making it harder to risk intimacy, to be productive, to achieve wisdom, because the foundational belief that the world can be counted on was never established. Erik knew this stage intimately, not just from observing his own children or his patients, but from something in his own history. Though he never wrote about it directly in this way, one can wonder about those early years with his mother before her marriage to Dr. Hamburger, the two of them alone in Frankfurt. Was there a quality of anxious attachment there? A mother worried about survival and reputation, a son clinging to his only anchor. And later, when the truth of his origins was revealed, did some basic trust in the reliability of his caregiver's narrative shatter? The first stage is also when cultural variation is most visible. Erik observed that the Sioux nursed their infants for years, with the child having free access to the breast whenever desired, fostering a deep sense of abundance and trust. Western European culture, by contrast, often emphasized scheduled feeding, early weaning, training the infant to self-soothe, fostering independence early. Each approach shapes the quality of trust differently, creating different balances between confidence in others and confidence in self. This first stage occurs, Erik said, primarily in the first year to 18 months of life, though, like all the stages, it has no rigid boundaries. And importantly, the crisis of trust versus mistrust does not end with infancy. It can be reactivated later in life, during times of vulnerability, during illness, loss, trauma, or old age, when we once again become dependent and must confront the question of whether the world and the people in it can be trusted to care for us. As the child moves into the second and third years of life, a fundamental shift occurs. The helpless infant who could only signal needs now becomes a toddler who can walk, grasp, manipulate objects, and, most significantly, say no. This is the period Freud called the anal stage, focused on toilet training and the battle of wills between parent and child over control of the body's functions. Erik again accepted the bodily focus, but expanded its meaning. The central psychological task of this stage is the development of autonomy, the capacity to be self-directing, to have will, to make choices, to control oneself and one's environment. The toddler is discovering agency, the thrilling and terrifying realization that I can do things. The child can walk away, can hold on or let go, can refuse food, can insist on a particular toy, can assert a separateness from the parent. This assertion of will is necessary and healthy. It is the beginning of the child becoming an individual, distinct from the mother, with separate desires and capacities. But it is also dangerous. The toddler's capacities far exceed their judgment. They want to climb things that are unsafe, touch things that are hot, wander into streets. They have desires that cannot be fulfilled. They lack the language and cognitive capacity to understand why they cannot always have their way. Into this developmental moment comes toilet training, which Erik saw as the cultural arena where the battle between autonomy and control is often staged. The child is asked to control a bodily function, to inhibit a natural process, to meet a social expectation on a timetable set by others. How this is handled becomes paradigmatic of how autonomy is negotiated. If parents are patient, supportive, and respectful of the child's developing control, offering praise for successes but not shaming failures, the child learns that self-control is possible and even satisfying. The child begins to experience the pleasure of mastery, of doing things by myself, of being competent. This is autonomy, not wild, unrestricted freedom, but self-regulation within a structure of expectation, the capacity to govern oneself. But if parents are harsh, punitive, or shaming, if they communicate that the child's messes are disgusting, that failures of control are personal failures, that the child's emerging will is bad or dangerous, then the child develops shame and doubt. Shame is the feeling of being watched and judged, of being found wanting, of wanting to disappear. It is the sense that the self is inherently flawed, dirty, unacceptable. Doubt is the uncertainty about one's own capacities, the fear that one cannot trust one's own impulses or abilities. Erik was particularly interested in the social dimension of shame. Unlike guilt, which is an internal feeling about having done something wrong, shame is about being someone wrong. It requires an audience, real or imagined, whose gaze renders the self visible and defective. The shamed child wants to hide, to cover up, to make the self invisible. This is the opposite of autonomy, which requires being visible as an agent, confidently inhabiting one's actions. The healthy resolution of this stage produces the virtue of will or willpower, the ego strength to make choices, to exercise self-restraint when appropriate, to be persistent in pursuing goals, and to balance free choice with acceptance of necessary limits. The child with healthy autonomy can say both, I want to do it myself and I need help, can be both independent and cooperative. But poor resolution leads to compulsive doubt and over-control or, conversely, to shameless impulsivity and lack of self-regulation. Some children respond to shaming by becoming rigidly controlled, obsessively neat, unable to tolerate any mess or mistake. Others respond by becoming defiant and reckless, rejecting all external limits because limits have been experienced as total domination rather than protective structure. Erik observed that cultures differ greatly in how they manage this stage. Some cultures value obedience and early suppression of individual will, training children to defer to elders and community norms without question. Other cultures, particularly modern Western ones, emphasize independence and self-expression, encouraging toddlers to make choices and assert preferences. Each approach produces different balances of autonomy, shame, and doubt, shaping different character structures adapted to different social environments. In his own life, Erik could reflect on the shame of being different, of being marked by his appearance as neither fully Jewish nor fully German, of carrying a secret about his origins. This early experience of being looked at and found not to fit surely informed his understanding of shame as a core developmental challenge. Around ages 4 to 6, the child who has developed trust and autonomy now begins to imagine and plan. This is the period Freud called the phallic stage, dominated by the Oedipus complex and the child's romantic attachment to the opposite sex parent. Erik did not reject the Oedipal drama, but he reframed it within a broader context of the child developing initiative. Initiative is the capacity to conceive of goals and pursue them, to imagine possibilities and act to make them real. The child in this stage is endlessly curious, asking why about everything, proposing elaborate games and projects, imagining futures, trying on different roles through fantasy play. The girl announces she will be a doctor or a princess or a astronaut. The boy builds structures with blocks, stages battles with toy soldiers, declares he will be a firefighter. This is the flowering of imagination and purpose. But with this capacity to initiate action comes the possibility of overstepping boundaries, of desiring things that are forbidden, of pursuing goals that bring one into conflict with others. The Oedipal child desires exclusive possession of the beloved parent, wishes to displace the rival parent, imagines scenarios that violate the family structure. The child's grandiose fantasies are not matched by their actual power, leading to frustration and conflict. When parents respond to the child's initiative with encouragement, channeling the child's energy into achievable projects, answering questions patiently, and setting limits without crushing spirit, the child learns that their ideas and ambitions are valuable, that action is good, that they can make things happen. The child develops the ego strength of purpose, the courage to envision and pursue goals, the sense that life has direction and meaning. But if parents are repressive, if they laugh at the child's ambitions as silly, if they punish curiosity as intrusive, if they respond to the child's sexual curiosity and romantic fantasies with horror or severe punishment, the child develops a heavy burden of guilt. Guilt, unlike shame, is about having done something wrong rather than being something wrong. It is the internal voice of the superego, which is forming strongly during this period, saying, "You should not have done that," or "You should not want that." Erik understood guilt as necessary for moral development. We need an internal sense of right and wrong, a capacity to feel uncomfortable when we have violated our values. But excessive guilt becomes paralyzing. The child who is made to feel that their desires and initiatives are fundamentally bad may become inhibited, afraid to want anything, unable to set goals or take action. Such a child becomes passive, waiting for permission, afraid to express themselves. Erik noted that this stage is when gender roles are most actively taught and internalized. Boys and girls begin to observe and imitate the behaviors associated with their gender in their culture, trying on these roles through play. The culture's expectations about what men and women should be, should do, should want, become part of the child's emerging identity. This process can be supportive or constraining, depending on how rigid the roles are and how well they fit the individual child's temperament and talents. In cultures where boys are taught that initiative means aggression and competition, and girls are taught that initiative should be limited to domestic spheres, the development of purpose can be warped by gender expectations. Erik saw this clearly in his clinical work. He encountered women whose considerable ambitions had been stifled by cultural prohibitions, leading to depression and resentment. He saw men who had been pushed into competitive, aggressive stances that violated their gentle temperaments, leading to anxiety and conflict. The child who successfully navigates this stage emerges with the confidence to dream and plan, to ask questions and seek knowledge, to play and create. while also having internalized appropriate limits, a conscience that regulates behavior without crushing the spirit of exploration. With entry into school, usually around ages 6 to 12, the child enters what Freud called the latency period, a supposed pause in psychosexual development between the Oedipal drama and puberty. Erik saw this period not as latent at all, but as intensely productive, the time when the child develops competence and skill. Industry means the capacity to work steadily toward a goal, to learn and practice, to master the tools and technologies of one's culture. The school-age child is learning to read and write and calculate, but also learning the informal skills of their world, how to ride a bike, how to play games with rules, how to make friends, how to navigate social hierarchies, how to use the objects and technologies that structure daily life. This is a period of enormous cognitive growth. The child can now think logically about concrete objects and events, can classify and order information, can understand rules and apply them consistently. But even more than cognitive development, this stage is about the self-concept as a worker and producer, as someone who can make things and do things well. The child compares their work to that of peers and to standards set by teachers and parents. They bring home a drawing or a math test or a project, and the response they receive shapes their sense of competence. Praise and recognition foster a sense of industry. I am good at things. I can learn. I can contribute. The child develops the ego strength of competence, the confidence that effort leads to achievement, that one can acquire skills and use them effectively. But if the child repeatedly experiences failure, if their work is always found inadequate, if they are compared unfavorably to siblings or peers, if they fall behind in school and are labeled as slow or stupid, they develop a sense of inferiority. They come to believe, I am not good at things. I cannot learn. I am less than others. This inferiority becomes a core part of identity, affecting self-esteem and motivation for the rest of life. Erik was particularly attuned to how social class, culture, and opportunity affect this stage. A child in a well-resourced school with supportive teachers and access to books, computers, and enrichment activities has many opportunities to develop competence. A child in an underfunded school, or a child whose home language and culture are different from the dominant school culture, faces additional barriers. If the skills valued by the school do not match the child's abilities or cultural background, the child may develop a sense of inferiority, even though they might be quite competent in other contexts. He also noted that industrialized societies create a particular form of this crisis. Work becomes specialized, technical, and abstract. Children are trained not in the visible, tangible skills of farming or craft production, but in literacy, numeracy, and abstract reasoning. Success requires years of schooling, delaying the time when one can feel fully competent as an adult worker. This prolongation of the learning period creates both opportunities for growth and risks of prolonged feelings of inadequacy. In his work with the Sioux, Erik observed a different model. Sioux children learned through observation and participation in adult activities. A boy learned to hunt by watching older hunters gradually taking on more responsibility. A girl learned to prepare food and make clothing by working alongside her mother and aunts. Competence was built through direct apprenticeship, with clear markers of progress and eventual mastery. But the destruction of the traditional economy meant these paths to competence were blocked, leaving young people with no clear way to develop a sense of industry within their own culture. Erik himself had experienced a prolonged period of this stage, his years of wandering and artistic study, a kind of extended workshop phase where he was learning not technical skills, but how to observe, how to think, how to be in the world. His eventual competence as a psychoanalyst was hard-won, built on this long apprenticeship. Here we arrive at the stage most associated with Erik's name, the crisis that he not only described, but also named and popularized, the formation of identity in adolescence. This is the stage that grows directly from Erik's own experience and became his most influential contribution to psychology and culture. Adolescence is the period from roughly ages 12 to 18, sometimes extending into the 20s in modern societies. It is marked by the biological changes of puberty, but is much more than a physical transformation. It is a psychological revolution, a fundamental reorganization of the self. The adolescent must integrate all that has come before the trust of infancy, the autonomy of the toddler, the initiative of the preschooler, the competence of the school years into a coherent sense of who one is. But they must do this at a moment when everything is changing. The body is suddenly different, sexually mature, unfamiliar. Cognitive capacities expand, allowing for abstract thought, self-reflection, and the ability to imagine multiple possible futures. Social roles shift dramatically, as the adolescent is no longer a child but not yet an adult, expected to begin making choices about education, career, relationships, values, and identity. The central task is to answer the question, who am I? Not in the simple sense of a name or family, but in the deeper sense of what I stand for, what I believe, what I will do with my life, how I am both similar to and different from others, what my life means, and where it is going. This is identity, a stable, consistent, and coherent sense of self that persists across time and contexts. Erik described identity as having several components. There is the sense of inner continuity, that the person I am today is recognizably the same person I was yesterday and will be tomorrow, despite changes and growth. There is the experience of solidarity with a group identifying with a community, culture, ideology, or movement that gives one a sense of belonging and shared purpose. And there is the achievement of ego identity, the feeling that one's uniqueness is recognized and valued by others, that society has a place for the self one is becoming. The danger of this stage is what Erik famously termed identity confusion or role confusion. This is the state of not knowing who one is, of feeling fragmented, of being unable to commit to any path or role, of experiencing the self as a collection of incompatible parts rather than a unified whole. The adolescent in identity confusion might feel like a chameleon, taking on different personalities in different contexts with no stable core. They might feel paralyzed by choices, unable to commit to any direction, because all directions seem equally arbitrary or equally impossible. Erik identified several forms of identity confusion. Some adolescents experience a negative identity, deliberately choosing to be what parents and society most reject as a way of at least having some clear definition, even if it is a rejected one. The juvenile delinquent, the dropout, the rebel without a cause, these were, Erik suggested, sometimes desperate attempts to forge an identity when positive identity formation seemed impossible. Other adolescents experience identity diffusion, a scattering of the self across incompatible roles and contexts, with no integration. Still others undergo a prolonged identity crisis, a period of anxiety, experimentation, and searching that extends years beyond what the culture considers normal. And some foreclose on identity prematurely, adopting without question the identity prescribed by parents or culture, achieving apparent stability but at the cost of genuine self-discovery. The healthy resolution of this stage produces the virtue of fidelity, the capacity to commit oneself, to be loyal, to maintain faith with one's values, relationships, and chosen path, even in the face of contradictions and challenges. Fidelity is not blind obedience, but authentic commitment based on freely chosen values. It is the ego strength that allows one to say, "This is who I am," and to live that truth consistently. Erik emphasized that identity formation is not entirely an individual process. It depends on society providing what he called a psychosocial moratorium, a sanctioned period of exploration where young people can try on different roles, experiment with different beliefs and relationships, make mistakes and change direction, without suffering permanent consequences. Traditional societies provided this through clearly defined coming-of-age rituals and transition periods. Modern societies provide it less formally through extended education, gap years, youth subcultures, and the general expectation that adolescence is a time of exploration. But not all adolescents have access to a true moratorium. Young people in poverty, those forced to work to support families, those in war zones or refugee situations, those facing discrimination or violence, may have no space for exploration. They must commit to survival strategies immediately, foreclosing on identity without the luxury of choice. This creates what Erik called a premature crystallization of identity, often around roles imposed by necessity rather than discovered through exploration. Erik wrote about his own prolonged identity crisis in veiled terms, his years of wandering, his uncertainty about vocation, his struggle with his mixed heritage and uncertain parentage. He understood from the inside what it meant to feel divided, to not know where one belonged, to search for a coherent self amid contradictions. His self-naming, his choice to become Erik Erikson, was the resolution of his own identity crisis, a decisive act of self-authorship. He also noted that historical moments affect identity formation. He worked with veterans returning from World War II, young men who had been soldiers and now had to reintegrate into civilian life, finding an identity beyond warrior. He observed the youth culture of the 1950s and 60s, the rebels and beatniks, and eventually the counterculture activists, young people searching for authenticity in a conformist society. His concept of identity crisis became a cultural catchphrase, widely adopted to describe everything from adolescent angst to midlife transitions to national political upheaval. Once a relatively stable identity has been achieved, the young adult faces a new challenge: intimacy. This stage typically unfolds in the 20s and 30s, the period when people form committed romantic partnerships, deep friendships, and meaningful, collaborative relationships. Intimacy, for Erik, meant the capacity to merge one's identity with another's without fear of losing oneself, to open oneself fully to another person, to share one's inner world and to receive the inner world of another. It requires vulnerability, the willingness to be known, to show one's weaknesses and needs, to depend on someone else. And it requires the security of identity. One must know who one is, before one can risk intimacy. Because intimacy involves a temporary dissolving of boundaries, a fusion and confusion of self and other that would be catastrophic for someone whose identity was still fragile. Erik defined intimacy broadly, not limiting it to sexual relationships. It includes deep friendship, partnerships in work or creative endeavors, the experience of genuine connection and mutual understanding. It is the capacity to be with another person in a state of openness and authenticity, without masks or performances. The danger of this stage is isolation, the failure to achieve intimacy, the experience of being fundamentally alone even when surrounded by others. Isolation can take several forms. Some people protect themselves from intimacy out of fear, maintaining a fortress self that allows no one truly in. They may have many superficial relationships, but no deep ones, no one who truly knows them. Others attempt intimacy, but sabotage it through jealousy, control, or betrayal, unable to tolerate the vulnerability that real connection requires. Erik noted a gender dimension to this stage, shaped by cultural expectations. In mid-20th century America, when he was writing, women were often expected to achieve identity through intimacy, to define themselves primarily through relationships to others as wives, mothers, daughters. Men, conversely, were expected to achieve identity through work, and then, only after establishing career and status, to risk intimacy. Erik was critical of these rigid patterns, seeing how they distorted development for both sexes. For women, the pressure to achieve intimacy before identity was firmly established could lead to a loss of self, to defining oneself entirely through relationships, to having no autonomous identity apart from the roles of wife and mother. For men, the delay of intimacy until after career was established could lead to emotional isolation, an inability to be vulnerable, and underdevelopment of relational capacities. Erik advocated for a more flexible model, where identity and intimacy could develop more simultaneously, supporting rather than undermining each other. The successful resolution of this stage yields the virtue of love, not romantic love in the narrow sense, but the ego's strength to give oneself to another, to care deeply, to commit to mutual growth and well-being. This love is mature, reciprocal, and resilient, able to weather conflict and difference, because it is grounded in respect for both self and other. But failure in this stage leads to a pattern of shallow relationships, fear of commitment, chronic loneliness, and a sense that life, despite accomplishments, is emotionally empty. Erik observed many successful professionals, particularly men, who had achieved career goals but were isolated, unable to form deep connections, living lives of quiet desperation behind facades of competence and control. Erik's own marriage to Joan was, by most accounts, a genuine intimacy. They worked together intellectually, raised 4 children together, weathered the dislocations of emigration and the challenges of Erik's career. Joan was Erik's editor and collaborator, though her contributions were often invisible in the formal record. Theirs was a partnership of the sort Erik theorized emerging that enhanced rather than diminished each partner's identity. As adults move into middle age, roughly from the late 30s through the 60s, a new developmental task emerges. Having established identity and intimacy, the question becomes, what will I contribute? What will I leave behind? How will I care for the next generation and ensure that the world continues beyond my own lifespan? Erik called this crisis generativity versus stagnation. Generativity means productivity and creativity directed beyond the self toward the welfare of others, particularly the next generation. It is the capacity to be generative, to generate whether that means bearing and raising children, creating works of art or science, building institutions, teaching and mentoring, engaging in community service, or any activity that transcends personal gain and contributes to the larger flow of life. At its heart, generativity is about care, the expansion of concern beyond oneself and one's immediate intimates, to include those who are younger, those who will come after, the ongoing life of the community and species. It is the adult's responsibility to nurture and guide the next generation, to pass on skills and values, to ensure that something of value survives one's own death. The most obvious form of generativity is parenting. Raising children is an intensely generative act, requiring years of care, sacrifice, teaching, and support. But Erik was clear that parenthood is not the only path to generativity. Many people without biological children are deeply generative through teaching, mentoring, creative work, or social activism. Conversely, some people have children but fail to be truly generative with them, neglecting or abusing them, failing to nurture their development. Stagnation is the danger of this stage. Stagnation means turning inward, becoming preoccupied with one's own needs and comforts to the exclusion of broader concerns, failing to grow or produce anything of lasting value. The stagnant person might become self-indulgent, treating themselves like their own spoiled child, or might become embittered and envious, resenting the vitality and promise of younger people. Stagnation is a kind of developmental arrest, a refusal or inability to move beyond the self. Erik noted that generativity includes a tension between creating and caring. Creating is the more outward-directed activity, generating new ideas, products, institutions. Caring is the more nurturing activity, maintaining, protecting, guiding what has been created. Healthy generativity balances both. The parent must both create, bringing a child into the world, and care, nurturing that child to maturity. The artist must both create, making the work, and care, preserving and sharing it with others. The teacher must both create, developing curriculum and ideas, and care, attending to the individual needs of students. The virtue that emerges from successful generativity is care, the ego strength to commit oneself to others and to the future, to take responsibility, to nurture and guide, to put the needs of the next generation above one's own immediate gratification. Care is the mature form of love, expanded beyond intimate partners to include a broader community, but failure to develop. Generativity leads to what Erik called pseudo-intimacy, a kind of inward-focused pairing where adults remain absorbed in their own relationship to the exclusion of larger concerns, or to a pervading sense of stagnation and personal impoverishment, a feeling that life has become empty, repetitive, without purpose or growth. Erik was in his 40s and 50s when he formulated this stage, clearly working through his own midlife questions of generativity. His teaching, his clinical work, his research, and his writing were all forms of generativity. He was passing on the psychoanalytic tradition, mentoring younger scholars, contributing to cultural understanding through his books. and he and Joan were raising their children, navigating the challenges of parenting in a rapidly changing cultural context. But Erik's understanding of generativity was also shaped by the larger historical moment. He was writing in the aftermath of World War II, at a time when the capacity of one generation to destroy the future for all subsequent generations had become horrifyingly clear. The atomic bomb had demonstrated that human generativity could be matched or exceeded by human destructiveness. How does one maintain generative concern for the future when the future itself is threatened by weapons of total annihilation? This question haunted Erik's later work, pushing him toward increasing concern with ethical and political issues. The final stage of Erik's model concerns old age, from late 60s onward to the end of life. This is the stage he was himself living through when he refined and wrote most extensively about it. The central crisis is between integrity and despair, between accepting one's life as it has been lived or rejecting it as meaningless and wasted. Integrity, Erik said, is the acceptance of one's one and only life cycle as something that had to be and that permitted of no substitutions. It is the sense that one's life, with all its choices, errors, losses, and achievements, has had coherence and meaning. It is coming to terms with mortality, accepting that life is finite, that time has run its course, that death is approaching and is acceptable. This integrity involves several elements. There is the integration of one's life narrative into a coherent story, seeing how the various stages and choices fit together into a meaningful whole, even if the meaning only becomes clear in retrospect. There is the acceptance of one's parents and upbringing, coming to peace with whatever hurts or limitations they imposed, recognizing them as products of their own time and circumstances. There is the acceptance of one's culture and era, taking a certain pride or at least equanimity in having lived when and where one did, contributing what one could to the ongoing human project. Integrity also requires accepting that life's ultimate questions may not have answers, that ambiguity and mystery are inherent to existence, that wisdom includes acknowledging the limits of wisdom. It is a kind of mature serenity, a looking back without overwhelming regret, and a looking forward to death without overwhelming fear. The danger of this stage is despair, the feeling that life has been wasted, that it is now too late to start again or to make different choices, that death is approaching and one's life has lacked meaning. Despair carries with it a disgust with oneself and with humanity, a bitterness about missed opportunities, a fear of death as oblivion rather than completion. The despairing elder becomes bitter, demanding, chronically dissatisfied, contemptuous of others, especially the young who still have time to make different choices. Erik noted that despair is often hidden behind a mask of pseudo-integrity, a kind of defensive grandiosity where the elder insists that their life has been perfect, their choices always right, that they have no regrets. But this is brittle, a protest against underlying despair rather than genuine integration. True integrity can acknowledge mistakes and regrets while still affirming that the life as a whole was worthwhile. The virtue of this final stage is wisdom, the ego's strength to maintain and convey integrity of experience despite the inevitable decline of body and mind, to look at life with a kind of detached yet active concern, with life itself in the face of death itself. Wisdom is the cumulative fruit of all the earlier ego strengths, hope, will, purpose, competence, fidelity, love, and care, now ripened into a mature understanding of life's patterns and meanings. Erik drew on various cultural traditions in describing wisdom. He looked at the figure of the wise elder in many cultures, the grandfather or grandmother, who serves as keeper of stories, advisor to the young, embodiment of the community's accumulated experience. He was influenced by Asian philosophies, particularly Buddhist notions of equanimity and acceptance. And he thought about the role of the elderly in modern Western societies, often marginalized and devalued, deprived of meaningful roles, their wisdom disregarded in a culture obsessed with youth and novelty. He argued that failure to value the elderly and to provide roles that allow them to maintain integrity is not just cruel to individuals, but damaging to the entire culture. When the elderly are warehoused in nursing homes, when their experience is dismissed as irrelevant, when they are isolated from younger generations, the society loses access to wisdom, loses the long perspective that only a full lifespan can provide. And the young lose the capacity to see life as a meaningful whole rather than a disconnected series of moments. Erik himself worked to maintain integrity as he aged. He continued writing into his 80s, reflecting on the life cycle, on culture and ethics, on the challenges facing humanity. He returned in his mind to the question of identity that had preoccupied him since youth, now from the vantage point of late life. His last major work, written with his wife Joan and published when he was in his 80s, was Vital Involvement in Old Age, a study of elderly people maintaining active engagement with life. It was both a research project and a personal testament, Erik investigating and modeling the integrity he theorized. He and Joan interviewed elderly people, asking them about their lives, their regrets, their satisfactions, their fears, their hopes. What they found confirmed Erik's theory. Those who could construct a coherent narrative of their lives, who felt their lives had contributed something, who maintained relationships and interests, who accepted mortality without terror, exhibited wisdom and integrity. Those who felt their lives had been meaningless, who were isolated and bitter, who could not accept aging and death, exhibited despair. Erik died in 1994 at the age of 91, his long life spanning nearly the entire 20th century. He lived through 2 world wars, the rise and fall of fascism and communism, the atomic age, the civil rights movement, the sexual revolution, the digital revolution's beginnings. He emigrated from Europe to America, from a culture of limits and traditions to one of possibility and reinvention. And through it all, he maintained the central questions of identity, development, culture, and meaning. By all accounts, he achieved the integrity he theorized, coming to the end of his life with a sense of completion, his contribution made, his story told. Underlying Erik's 8 stages is what he called the epigenetic principle, a concept borrowed from embryology that became central to his developmental theory. In biological development, epigenesis refers to the process by which an organism develops through a series of predetermined but flexible stages, each building on the previous one, each emerging at its proper time according to an inner blueprint. Erik applied this concept to psychological development. He argued that human development proceeds according to a ground plan, a sequence of potentials that unfold in a predetermined order. The capacity for trust must develop before autonomy, autonomy before initiative, and so on. Each stage has its critical period, a time when the particular ego strength associated with that stage is most readily developed. If that critical period passes without adequate resolution of the stage's crisis, later development is compromised. But crucially, Erik's epigenetic principle is not rigidly biological. The potentials unfold only in interaction with the environment, especially the social environment. The infant is ready to develop trust, but whether trust actually develops depends on having caregivers who are trustworthy. The adolescent is ready to form an identity, but whether a coherent identity forms depends on having a culture that provides clear enough roles and values to identify with, while also allowing enough flexibility for individual variation. This emphasis on the interaction between biological readiness and social facilitation was Erik's way of bridging psychoanalysis and anthropology, nature and nurture, the individual and society. He rejected both pure biological determinism and pure cultural relativism. Human development has a universal structure, he argued, but the content of each stage, the particular form that ego strengths take, varies enormously across cultures. For example, all cultures must help infants develop basic trust, but what trustworthiness means differs. In some cultures, it means consistent physical presence of the mother. In others, it means a network of caregivers, so that the child is always attended, but not always by the same person. In some cultures, feeding happens on demand. In others, on schedule. All these patterns can foster trust if they are consistent within the culture's logic. Similarly, all adolescents face the task of forming an identity, but what identity consists of differs profoundly. In a traditional society with clearly defined roles, identity formation might mean accepting one's assigned place in a caste or kinship system, becoming the person one's birth destined one to be. In a modern individualistic society, identity formation means making choices among many possibilities, constructing a unique self. Both are identity formation, but they proceed through different processes and yield different results. Erik's anthropological work with Native American communities deepened his understanding of cultural variation. The Sioux and the Yurok, though both indigenous North American peoples, had radically different cultural systems and accordingly shaped different character structures in their children. The Sioux, historically a hunting and warrior culture, valued generosity, bravery, and mobility, and their child-rearing fostered these qualities. The Yurok, a fishing and gathering culture, valued frugality, cleanliness, and carefulness, and their practices fostered these qualities instead. But Erik also saw how cultural disruption creates developmental pathology when a culture's traditional practices are destroyed or discredited, when people are forced to assimilate into a foreign cultural system, when the old ways no longer work but new ways have not been fully adopted. Identity formation becomes profoundly difficult. This was the tragedy he witnessed. On the reservations, young people, caught between two worlds, unable to form coherent identities because both identity systems were unavailable or inadequate. He later extended this analysis to African Americans in the United States, studying how racism and oppression affected identity development. In a society that systematically denigrated blackness, that offered limited and often negative identity options to black children, how could healthy identity formation occur? Erik argued that black Americans had to construct positive identities in the teeth of massive cultural opposition, a heroic psychological achievement. This work led him to understand identity as always political, always involving questions of power and recognition. Who gets to define who you are? whose narratives of identity are validated by the culture and whose are suppressed or pathologized? These questions pushed Erik's psychology in increasingly social and ethical directions. In midlife, Erik pioneered a new form of inquiry that he called psychohistory, the psychological study of historical figures, using psychoanalytic and developmental concepts to understand their motivations, their crises, and their impacts. This was biography as psychological investigation, history as the study of identity formation in particular times and places. His first major psychohistorical work was Young Man Luther, a study in psychoanalysis and history, published in 1958. In this book, Erik explored the young Martin Luther's identity crisis and how it connected to his religious revolution. Luther, he argued, experienced profound identity confusion as a young man, tormented by feelings of sinfulness and unworthiness, unable to satisfy his harsh superego through any amount of piety or penance. Luther's famous insight that salvation comes through faith alone, not through works, was, Erik suggested, a resolution of his personal identity crisis that also spoke to a larger cultural crisis in early 16th century Europe. The Catholic Church's system of indulgences and works had become corrupt and psychologically unsatisfying. People were searching for a more direct relationship with God, for a sense of worthiness not dependent on institutional mediation. Luther's personal solution became a cultural revolution because it articulated what many were feeling. Erik was careful not to reduce Luther's theology to mere psychology. He argued that we must take seriously the religious content of Luther's experience, not dismiss it as a sublimation or symptom. But we can also understand how psychological crisis and cultural moment intersect in the lives of great innovators. Luther transformed his personal crisis into a universal message that reshaped Western civilization. Erik's second major psychohistorical work was Gandhi's Truth on the Origins of Militant Nonviolence, published in 1969 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Here, Erik examined Mohandas Gandhi, focusing on a particular event in 1918 when Gandhi led a strike of textile workers in Ahmedabad, India. This event, Erik argued, was a turning point where Gandhi fully articulated his philosophy and practice of nonviolent resistance. Erik saw in Gandhi a man who, like Luther, transformed personal crisis into cultural innovation. Gandhi struggled throughout his life with anger and violence, with a legacy of British colonialism that had humiliated India and Indians, with the question of how to be both true to Indian identity and effective in confronting colonial power. His solution, militant nonviolence, satyagraha, or truth force, was both a political strategy and a psychological discipline, a way of fighting that did not perpetuate the cycle of violence and humiliation. But Erik's study of Gandhi was more complex than hagiography. He questioned some of Gandhi's methods, particularly his use of fasting as political leverage, which Erik saw as potentially manipulative, a form of passive aggression disguised as spirituality. He examined Gandhi's troubled relationships with his wife and sons, his sexual renunciation and experimentation, his rigid self-discipline that sometimes shaded into self-punishment. The book is structured partly as a letter to Gandhi, Erik addressing his subject directly, a blurring of scholarly distance that reflects the personal nature of psychohistorical inquiry. Erik was not pretending to objective detachment. He was engaging with Gandhi as one would with a patient or a mentor, critically but respectfully, trying to understand the man's struggles and achievements from the inside, while also maintaining ethical judgment. Through these psychohistories, Erik demonstrated several principles. First, that individual psychology and historical moment are inseparable. Great figures are those whose personal crises resonate with larger cultural crises, whose solutions become solutions for many. Second, that identity formation is the central drama of great lives. Luther and Gandhi both underwent prolonged identity crises and emerged with powerful, coherent identities that allowed them to lead transformative movements. Third, that understanding historical change requires understanding the psychological dimensions of how people experience their times and construct their responses. These works were controversial. Some historians objected that Erik was psychologizing history, reducing complex social and political events to individual psychology. Some psychoanalysts objected that he was applying clinical concepts to figures he could never analyze, speculating about inner states without sufficient evidence. But Erik defended psychohistory as a necessary bridging discipline, arguing that we cannot understand history without understanding the people who made it, and we cannot understand people without understanding their psychological development. While Erik was developing his stage theory and psychohistorical method, he was also observing and engaging with the cultural upheavals of mid-20th century America. His concept of identity crisis became not just a technical term in developmental psychology, but a cultural phenomenon, a way of understanding the massive social changes of the post-war era. The term identity crisis entered popular vocabulary in the 1950s and 60s, used to describe everything from adolescent confusion to national self-examination. Erik had given people a language for something many were experiencing, a sense that old certainties about who one was and where one belonged were dissolving, that identity was not a given but had to be constructed and could be lost. Several factors contributed to this cultural identity crisis. The Second World War had disrupted millions of lives, sent men abroad, brought women into the workforce, created a generation of veterans who had experienced the extremes of human behavior and had to reintegrate into civilian society. The post-war economic boom created suburban prosperity, but also conformist pressure. The organization man in the gray flannel suit, the housewife in the tract home, both living roles that felt increasingly hollow. Technological change was accelerating. Television brought the wider world into living rooms, creating new forms of shared culture, but also new forms of alienation. Nuclear weapons created existential anxiety. The knowledge the civilization could end in a flash. The civil rights movement challenged the racial identity system that had structured American society. The women's movement challenged gender roles and family structures. For young people especially, these changes created the conditions for widespread identity crisis. The old markers of adulthood were changing. Men could no longer simply follow their fathers into the same jobs. Women were questioning whether their only identities should be wife and mother. Young people had more education, more mobility, more choices, but also more confusion about what to choose and why. Erik studied college students going through what he called identity diffusion, young people who felt fragmented, directionless, unable to commit to any life path. He observed that many dealt with this by dropping out, either literally leaving school or psychologically withdrawing into apathy or substance use. Others dealt with it through political activism, finding identity through membership in movements for social change. The 1960s youth movements, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the counterculture, can be understood partly as collective identity formation. Young people were rejecting the identities offered by mainstream culture, the conformist, materialist, militarist identities of Cold War America, and searching for alternative identities grounded in different values: justice, peace, authenticity, community. Erik was largely sympathetic to this youth rebellion, seeing it as a healthy response to a culture that had become psychologically stifling and ethically bankrupt. In books like Identity, Youth, and Crisis, published in 1968 at the height of the upheavals, he analyzed the youth movements as attempts to construct positive identities in a time when traditional identities had lost credibility. But he also warned against what he called totalistic identities, rigid ideological systems that offer certainty and belonging at the cost of individual autonomy and critical thinking. He saw danger in movements that demanded total commitment, that divided the world into absolute categories of good and evil, that allowed no ambiguity or doubt. Whether it was fascism or communism or even some forms of religious fundamentalism, totalistic systems offered a seductive certainty of identity without the difficult work of genuine identity formation. True identity, Erik argued, requires what he called the disciplined subjectivity of the ego, the capacity to commit oneself to values and roles while maintaining the ability to reflect, to doubt, to grow and change. It is a balance between commitment and flexibility, between belonging and autonomy, between being shaped by culture and shaping culture. One of Erik's most beautiful formulations was his notion that the virtues that emerge from each life stage are not just individual achievements, but gifts that each generation offers to the next. The hope of the infant, once established, becomes the hope the parent can offer to their own infant. The fidelity of the adolescent, once achieved, becomes the model of commitment the adult can demonstrate to adolescents. The wisdom of the elder becomes the legacy passed to all younger generations. This creates what Erik called the cycle of generations, a dance of mutual care and mutual teaching where each stage of life has gifts to offer and needs to receive. Infants need the care of adults, but also give adults the opportunity to be generative, to love and nurture, to remember their own beginnings. Children need the guidance of adults, but also show adults the possibility of initiative and imagination, qualities adults may have lost in the grind of daily responsibility. Adolescents need the wisdom of elders, but also challenge elders with new ideas, new energy, the reminder that change is possible. This intergenerational mutuality is, Erik believed, essential to healthy societies. When the cycle is broken, when elders do not pass on wisdom, when adults are too narcissistic to be generative, when children are neglected or exploited, the entire social fabric begins to fray. Each generation needs the others, not just in practical terms, but in deep psychological and ethical terms. Erik was especially concerned about what he called generational narcissism, the tendency of each generation to become so absorbed in its own concerns that it loses sight of both those who came before and those who will come after. He saw this in the youth culture of the 60s, which sometimes dismissed everyone over 30 as irrelevant. But he also saw it in the older generation's dismissal of youth as irresponsible or immoral. True generativity, Erik argued, requires a kind of generational humility, a recognition that each stage of life has its own wisdom and its own limits. that we are all part of a larger flow of life that precedes and will follow us. The young need to learn from the old, but the old also need to learn from the young to remain open to new possibilities, to allow their certainties to be questioned. This vision of intergenerational mutuality informed Erik's thinking about education, which he saw as one of society's primary tools for facilitating development. Education, properly understood, is not just the transmission of information, but the facilitation of growth through each life stage, the provision of the experiences and challenges that allow ego strengths to develop. A good school helps young children develop industry by providing achievable challenges and recognizing accomplishment. A good college helps adolescents form identity by exposing them to diverse ideas and values, while also providing community and structure. A good society continues to educate adults, providing opportunities for generativity and integrity, ensuring that learning and growth do not stop at some arbitrary age. Erik believed deeply in what he called the golden rule in the light of a new insight. Traditional formulations of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, assume a kind of sameness, that what I want done to me is what others want. But Erik's developmental perspective suggests something more nuanced. Do unto others as would be most appropriate to their stage of life and their identity, recognizing that different people at different stages need different things. The infant needs unconditional care. The adolescent needs space to explore. The elder needs respect and roles that affirm their ongoing value. True care means attending to what the other actually needs, not projecting one's own needs onto them. This requires wisdom, the ability to see beyond oneself, to understand development not just from one's own position, but from the perspective of the whole life cycle. As Erik aged and continued to write, his concern increasingly turned to the challenges facing identity formation in late 20th century society. The world was changing faster than ever. Technology was transforming every aspect of life. Traditional communities were fragmenting. People moved frequently, changing jobs and locations, losing the stable contexts that once supported identity. Mass media created a flood of images and messages, making it harder to construct a coherent self amid the noise. Globalization was breaking down the cultural boundaries that once gave people clear identities. One could no longer assume that one's neighbors shared one's values, language, or worldview. This diversity created opportunities for growth and learning, but also anxiety and confusion. Who am I when I can choose among hundreds of possible identities? When the markers that once defined people, nationality, religion, occupation, family name, become increasingly fluid or optional. Erik saw both dangers and possibilities in these changes. The danger was what he called identity confusion on a massive scale. Whole populations experiencing fragmentation and alienation, unable to form coherent selves, vulnerable to totalitarian ideologies or consumerist manipulation that offered false certainties. When people do not have stable identities, they become desperate for anything that will give them a sense of who they are, making them susceptible to demagoguery, tribalism, and violence. But the possibility was that people could learn to construct identities that were more flexible, more inclusive, more conscious than the identities of earlier eras. Perhaps the modern self could be more like Erik's own self-hybrid, self-authored, capable of integrating multiple influences into something new. Perhaps identity in the global age could be less about conforming to inherited roles and more about authentic self-creation, less about narrow nationalism or tribalism, and more about planetary citizenship. This required, Erik believed, a new kind of education and a new ethical framework. People needed to be taught not just facts, but how to navigate complexity, how to tolerate ambiguity, how to construct meaning in a rapidly changing world. They needed to develop strong ego identities, not through rigid adherence to narrow roles, but through flexible integration of diverse experiences and influences. Erik's late work increasingly emphasized ethics and the relationship between individual development and collective survival. He became convinced that the psychological health of individuals and the health of societies and the health of the planet were all interconnected. If large numbers of people failed to develop trust, autonomy, initiative, competence, identity, intimacy, generativity, and integrity, the result would not just be individual suffering, but collective catastrophe. He pointed to the nuclear arms race as a prime example. The willingness of nations to stockpile weapons capable of destroying all life on Earth represented, he argued, a failure of generativity on a massive scale. It was the opposite of caring for future generations, a kind of species-wide stagnation and despair, a nihilistic rage that would rather destroy everything than face the hard work of building a sustainable future. Similarly, environmental destruction represented a failure of generativity. To poison the water and air, to drive species to extinction, to destabilize the climate, was to betray all future generations, to act as if only the present mattered. Erik saw these as fundamentally psychological and ethical problems, not just technical or political ones. They required a transformation of consciousness, a development of planetary generativity and integrity. In his last years, Erik wrote about the need for a species identity, a sense of belonging, not just to a family, community, or nation, but to humanity as a whole, and indeed, to the community of life on Earth. This was the ultimate expansion of identity, the final stage of moral and psychological development. But it was not an abandonment of particular identities. Rather, it was the ability to hold multiple identities simultaneously, to be a person with a unique name and story, a member of various communities, and also a human being and an earthling, with responsibilities at each level. Throughout his career, Erik worked not just as a theorist and researcher, but as an engaged citizen, applying his psychological insights to institutional and social change. He served as a consultant to educational institutions, helping to design programs that would foster healthy development. He worked with the Peace Corps in his early years, thinking about how young Americans could serve abroad in ways that fostered both their own identity development and genuine assistance to other cultures. He was active in the civil rights movement, supporting efforts to dismantle racism and create a more just society. He understood racism not just as a political problem, but as a profound assault on identity, a system that told certain people that they were inferior, unworthy, not fully human. The damage this did to the identity formation of Black children was, he argued, a crime against development itself, a systematic thwarting of the human potential to grow and flourish. He also thought deeply about the institutions of modern life, schools, corporations, governments, hospitals, prisons, and how they either supported or undermined development. An institution designed to foster development, he argued, would provide appropriate challenges and supports at each stage of life. would recognize the different needs of different age groups, would create environments where virtues could be cultivated. But many institutions did the opposite. Schools often crushed initiative and industry through rigid conformity and harsh competition. Corporations demanded loyalty while offering no job security, undermining fidelity and generativity. Prisons abandoned any pretense of rehabilitation, offering only punishment and degradation. Hospitals warehoused the elderly, stripping them of dignity and roles, making integrity impossible. Erik called for institutional reform guided by developmental principles. What would a school look like that truly fostered trust, autonomy, initiative, and industry? It would be safe and nurturing, would respect children's growing capacities for self-direction, would encourage curiosity and imagination, would offer challenges matched to ability and recognize accomplishment. It will look, in fact, much like the progressive schools Erik had taught in, like the Montessori method he had learned. What would a workplace look like that fostered generativity? It would give workers opportunities to be creative and productive, to contribute to something beyond themselves, to mentor younger workers, to feel that their labor had meaning. It would balance structure and autonomy, profit and purpose, individual achievement and communal good. What would a healthcare system look like that fostered integrity? It would respect the elderly, would maintain their autonomy as long as possible, would provide palliative care that allowed dignified dying, would value their wisdom and maintain their connections to younger generations. These were not just idealistic musings, but practical design questions. Erik believed that psychology, properly understood, was a tool for social transformation, for building institutions and cultures that allowed human beings to flourish across the entire lifespan. At the same time, Erik maintained throughout his life a dimension of his work that was more spiritual or existential than strictly scientific. He was interested in meaning, in the human search for significance and transcendence. His engagement with religion was complex. He was not conventionally religious, did not adhere to any particular faith tradition, yet he was drawn to religious questions and respected the role of religion in identity formation and cultural life. His psychohistorical studies of Luther and Gandhi were both studies of religious figures, men for whom spiritual questions were central. Erik took seriously their religious experiences, their sense of encounter with the divine, their ethical imperatives grounded in religious conviction. He did not reduce these to psychology, did not claim that religion was merely a projection or a symptom. Rather, he saw religion as one of the primary ways humans grapple with the ultimate questions of existence. Who am I? Why am I here? What is good? How should I live? What happens when I die? The ego strengths that emerged from each life stage had, for Erik, a quasi-spiritual dimension. Hope, will, purpose, competence, fidelity, love, care, wisdom. These were not just psychological capacities, but virtues in the classical sense, qualities of character that made for a good life. The person who had developed all these virtues was not just psychologically healthy, but good, living well, fulfilling human potential. And the final stage's achievement of integrity had an unmistakably spiritual quality, the acceptance of one's life as meaningful, despite its limitations, the reconciliation with mortality, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself that continues beyond one's death. This was not religion in the institutional sense, but it was certainly a kind of spirituality, a relationship to the transcendent dimensions of existence. Before we move toward the close of Erik's life, it is essential to pause and acknowledge more fully the partnership that sustained and shaped his work, his marriage, to Joan Erikson. Throughout Erik's career, Joan was far more than a supportive spouse. She was an intellectual collaborator, a fieldwork partner, an editor, and eventually a significant thinker in her own right, though her contributions were often invisible or credited only in acknowledgments. Joan accompanied Erik on his anthropological fieldwork with the Sioux and the Yurok, conducting her own observations and interviews, particularly with women, gaining insights that complemented and challenged Erik's. She was a trained teacher and Montessori educator, with her own expertise in child development and education. She read and commented on everything Erik wrote, pushing him to clarify his ideas, to write more accessibly, to consider dimensions he might have overlooked. In the intellectual culture of mid-20th century, women's contributions were systematically undervalued. Wives of famous men were expected to support, but not to overshadow, to assist, but not to claim credit. Joan mostly accepted this arrangement, though not without some resentment. She saw her role as enabling Erik's work, which she believed in deeply. But she also had her own ideas, her own insights, her own areas of expertise. In later years, Joan became more visible as a thinker. She wrote about activity, movement, and the role of craft and creativity in development. She was interested in how people express identity through making things, through the body's engagement with materials and tools. She thought about play not just in childhood, but throughout life, the human need for creative activity that is intrinsically satisfying rather than merely productive. After Erik's death, Joan continued to work and write into her 90s. She expanded Erik's original 8-stage model by adding a 9th stage, which she described from her own experience of very advanced old age. In this 9th stage, occurring for those who live beyond their 90s, the body's decline becomes so severe that many of the ego strengths previously achieved are challenged or partially lost. The very old person, Joan observed, might find that basic trust is tested by the unreliability of the body, that autonomy is compromised by increasing dependence, that sensory decline isolates them from the world. Yet this 9th stage is not simply a return to earlier crises. Rather, it is a new challenge, a final developmental task of maintaining some core of integrity and hope even as capacities fail, of accepting profound dependence without despair, of letting go of what one has been while maintaining some essential sense of self. Joan's 9th stage was a final gift to the developmental model she and Erik had built together, a contribution born of her own lived experience and her lifelong observation of human growth and decline. It reminded readers that development truly is lifelong, that we are not finished until we are finished, that each stage of life, even the final decline, has its own psychological and spiritual work. The Eriksons' marriage produced 4 children, and the family life provided Erik with a living laboratory for his theories. He observed his children's development, reflected on his own role as father, thought about how his parenting repeated or differed from how he had been parented. But family life was not always easy. One of their children, Neil, had Down syndrome and was eventually institutionalized, a decision that haunted both Erik and Joan. It was a reminder that development does not always proceed according to plan, that some lives are shaped by forces beyond psychological theory, that the neat models of stage theory must accommodate the messiness and tragedy of actual lives. As we move toward the close of this long night's exploration, let us consider the reach and influence of Erik Erikson's work. Few psychologists have had such extensive impact, not just within their discipline, but across culture more broadly. Erik's concepts entered the language, shaped how ordinary people think about growth and selfhood, influenced fields far beyond psychology. In education, Erik's stage model became foundational. Teachers learned to think about students not just as vessels to be filled with knowledge, but as developing persons moving through stages, each with his own needs and challenges. Elementary education came to emphasize the development of competence and industry. High schools and colleges came to see their role as facilitating identity formation, providing the moratorium where adolescents could explore and commit. Adult education programs recognize that learning continues throughout life, that middle-aged and older adults are still developing, still forming and reforming identity. In psychotherapy, Erik's concepts expanded the scope of clinical work. Therapists trained in the Eriksonian approach learned to assess where clients were in their developmental journey, what ego strengths they had or lacked, what stage-specific crises they were navigating. A therapist working with a young adult might focus on issues of intimacy and isolation. A therapist working with a middle-aged client might explore generativity and stagnation, asking about the client's sense of productivity and care for others. A therapist working with an elderly person might help them achieve integrity, constructing a narrative that makes sense of their life. Erik's emphasis on identity influenced many later theories. James Marcia developed a more detailed model of identity, statuses, identity achievement, moratorium, foreclosure, and diffusion building directly on Erik's work. Carol Gilligan challenged Erik's model from a feminist perspective, arguing that his focus on autonomy and separation reflected a male bias, that women's development might emphasize connection and care rather than individual identity. She pointed out that many of Erik's male subjects achieved identity before intimacy, while his female subjects often developed intimacy and identity simultaneously, or even achieved identity through relationship. This feminist critique led to important refinements. Later, developmental psychologists recognized that the sequence of stages might not be universal, that cultural context and gender socialization affect the order and nature of developmental crises. But rather than invalidating Erik's work, these critiques extended it, showing that the basic insight that development proceeds through stages, each with its own crisis and virtue, could be adapted and refined to account for diversity. In the field of lifespan developmental psychology, which emerged in the late 20th century, Erik is recognized as a founder. He was among the first to insist that development does not end with childhood or even with adolescence, that the entire lifespan is a trajectory of growth, crisis, and potential. This insight opened up whole new areas of research on adult development, midlife transitions, successful aging, dying, and death as developmental processes. In cultural studies and anthropology, Erik's work demonstrated how psychological concepts could be applied cross-culturally without being reductive. His respectful engagement with Native American communities, his recognition that culture shapes psyche and psyche shapes culture, his willingness to learn from cultures different from his own, all modeled how psychology could become less ethnocentric, less inclined to universalize from Western middle-class experience. Even in seemingly distant fields, Erik's influence appears. In the design of video games and virtual worlds, designers use stage models derived from Erik's work to create progression systems that match players' developing competencies. In organizational development, consultants apply Eriksonian concepts to help companies think about employee development across the career lifespan. In religious education, curricula are structured around the developmental stages, offering different forms of spiritual teaching appropriate to different ages. The concept of identity crisis, in particular, became ubiquitous. Politicians spoke of nations undergoing identity crisis. Journalists described corporations or movements as facing identity crisis. The term was sometimes used so loosely that it lost precision, becoming a catch-all for any confusion or transition. But its very popularity testified to how deeply Erik's insight resonated the idea that identity is not fixed, but must be constructed and can be lost. That coherence of self is an achievement that requires work and can fail. It is well into the night now, deep into these quiet hours when the world has softened into silence and the mind drifts between waking and sleeping. We have wandered through Erik Erikson's long life, from his uncertain beginnings to his wise old age, from Frankfurt to Vienna to America, from personal identity confusion to a comprehensive theory of human development. What have we learned in this long journey? Perhaps most fundamentally, we have learned that the self is not a thing but a process, not a static entity, but a lifelong becoming. We are never finished. From the first breath, when we begin to learn whether the world can be trusted, to the last breath, when we must finally accept our own story and its ending. We are always in the midst of growth, always facing new crises, always potentially developing new strengths. Erik's gift to us was a map of this process, a way of understanding the predictable stages and challenges that human beings face as they move from infancy to old age. But it was more than an abstract map. It was a compassionate recognition that each stage has its dignity and difficulty, that the struggles of a 2-year-old asserting autonomy are as real and significant as the struggles of an adolescent forming identity or an elder seeking integrity. He taught us that we are not isolated individuals developing in a vacuum, but social beings whose growth occurs always in relationship, always in cultural context. The infant's trust depends on trustworthy caregivers. The adolescent's identity depends on a culture that provides both structure and flexibility. The elder's integrity depends on a society that honors old age and maintains connection across generations. We shape each other. We grow through and with each other. He showed us that human development is both universal and particular. All human beings, across all cultures, face certain fundamental challenges as they grow. But the specific content of these challenges, the particular forms that virtues take, the meanings of concepts like autonomy and identity and integrity, all vary enormously. There is no one right way to develop, no single model of the healthy human being. There are only the universal tasks and the infinite variety of ways cultures and individuals accomplish them. Erik's own life embodied the developmental process he theorized. His early identity confusion, his wandering search for vocation, his eventual integration of art and science, psychoanalysis and anthropology, European and American influences, his self-naming and self-creation, his long productive midlife, his wise old age, all of it can be read as a living demonstration of the 8 stages, of the struggles and strength he described. And perhaps this is fitting. The best theories of human nature come from people who have deeply explored their own nature, who have faced their own developmental crises, and emerged with insights to share. Erik did not invent the life cycle, of course. He observed it in himself, in his children, in his patients, in cultures around the world. But he gave us language for it, structure for understanding it, hope that we might navigate it more consciously and compassionately. Let us return one last time to that final stage, to integrity versus despair, to the challenge that faces everyone who lives long enough to become old. This is the stage Erik himself lived through, the one he continued to refine and understand even as he experienced it. And it is the stage that, in a sense, encompasses all the others, because integrity requires looking back across the entire lifespan and accepting it as a whole. The person who has developed integrity can look back and see the pattern of their life, can trace the thread of identity through all its transformations, can recognize themselves in the infant they once were, and in all the stages between then and now. They can see their mistakes and regrets not as reasons for despair, but as parts of the story, necessary elements in becoming who they became. They can accept their parents and their culture, with all their limitations, as the necessary ground from which they grew. They can forgive themselves and others, not because all was right, but because all was human. All was part of the difficult project of being alive. Such a person can face death without overwhelming terror. Death is still unwelcome. Integrity is not the same as being done with life. But it is not unbearable. It is the natural end of the story, the punctuation that gives the narrative its shape. The person with integrity can say, with Tennyson's Ulysses, "I am a part of all that I have met," can feel themselves continuing in the lives they touched, the work they did, the love they gave, the wisdom they shared. But this integrity is not achieved once and for all. It must be maintained, practiced, especially as the body fails and the self-one becomes harder to sustain. This was Joan's insight in her 9th stage, born of her own experience in very old age. Integrity in the face of profound decline requires a kind of spiritual strength, a core of self that can persist even when much is lost, a hope that does not depend on capacity or achievement, but on some more fundamental trust in the value of having lived. This final virtue of wisdom is, in Erik's formulation, both deeply personal and transpersonal. It is personal in that it comes from accepting one's own unique life as it was lived. But it is transpersonal in that true wisdom sees beyond the individual life to the larger patterns of human existence, the cycle of generations, the flow of life itself. Wisdom knows that the individual life is both supremely important and relatively small, both the center of its own universe and a tiny part of a vast ongoing story. And so, as this long night approaches its end, as the darkness begins to thin toward dawn, we come to the close of our exploration. We have walked with Erik Erikson through his life and thought, through his stages and virtues, through his studies of culture and biography, through his struggles and achievements. What does it mean to spend 3 hours contemplating one man's theory of human development? Perhaps it means allowing ourselves to reflect on our own development, to locate ourselves in Erik's stages, to consider which ego strengths we have cultivated and which remain underdeveloped. Perhaps you are an adolescent, still forming identity, or a young adult navigating intimacy, or a midlife person seeking generativity, or an elder working toward integrity. Wherever you are in the life cycle, Erik's work offers a mirror and a map, a way of understanding where you have been and where you might be going. It means recognizing that growth is always possible, that each stage of life has its own gifts and tasks, that we are not finished until we die, and even then, we continue in the lives we have touched. It means seeing yourself not as a fixed self, but as a becoming, not as isolated, but as embedded in relationships and culture, not as judged by some external standard of success, but as engaged in the ancient human project of growing toward wisdom and integrity. Erik Erikson was born nameless, fatherless, confused about who he was and where he belonged. He died at 91, having given us a comprehensive theory of identity and development, having lived a full and generative life, having achieved integrity. The trajectory from one to the other is the trajectory of human development itself, the journey from helpless confusion to wise acceptance, from fragment to wholeness, from isolation to connection. His stages remain with us, embedded in how we think about childhood and education, adolescence and identity, adulthood and aging. When we speak of identity, crises, or midlife transitions, or wisdom in old age, we are speaking a language he helped create. When we recognize that we continue to grow and change throughout life, that each age has its own developmental work, we are thinking thoughts he clarified and popularized. But more than specific concepts, Erik left us an approach to human nature characterized by compassion, hopefulness, and faith in human potential. He believed that people can grow, that societies can create conditions for healthy development, that understanding ourselves psychologically can help us live better, more ethical, more meaningful lives. In an era of world wars and genocide, of nuclear weapons and environmental destruction, of profound injustice and suffering, he maintained hope. Not naive optimism, but hope, grounded in understanding of development, the conviction that if we can create conditions for trust, autonomy, initiative, competence, identity, intimacy, generativity, and integrity, we can create better human beings and therefore a better world. This hope, this first virtue that emerges from basic trust, carried him through his wandering youth and sustained him in his productive old age. It is perhaps what he offers us most fundamentally, not just a theory, but a hopeful vision of human possibility, the faith that we can understand ourselves and through understanding can grow. Rest now. Let these ideas settle into your mind like silt drifting to the bottom of a still pond. You need not remember everything, need not hold each stage and virtue in conscious awareness. The understanding will remain, a quiet presence, a way of seeing yourself and others with more compassion and depth. Erik Erikson's life spanned almost a century. From the final years of the 19th century to the final decade of the 20th. He witnessed transformations in society, technology, culture, politics, knowledge. Through it all, he held to certain fundamental insights about human nature, that we grow through crises, that development is lifelong, that identity must be constructed, that culture and psyche shape each other, that the life cycle has meaning, that wisdom is possible. He lived the theory he created, moving through all 8 stages himself, from uncertain beginnings to wise old age. He achieved generativity through his work and through his role as mentor to younger scholars. He achieved integrity, looking back on his life without overwhelming regret, seeing the pattern and purpose in his long journey. And finally, He achieved what his wife Joan would later call the work of the ninth stage, letting go with grace, accepting the final loss of capacity and control, facing death as the completion of the story rather than its negation. As you drift now toward sleep, you carry with you the knowledge that your own life is such a story, that you too are moving through stages, facing crises, developing strengths. You are not fixed. You are becoming. And this becoming continues until the end, each stage building on what came before, each age with its own beauty and challenge. May you develop trust in the basic goodness of existence. May you claim autonomy and will, making real choices about how to live. May you maintain initiative and purpose, daring to imagine and pursue what you desire. May you cultivate competence and skill, taking satisfaction in work well done. May you form a clear identity, knowing who you are amid all the pressures and possibilities. May you risk intimacy, opening yourself to deep connection with others. May you be generative, contributing something of value that outlasts your individual life. And in your final years, may you achieve integrity, accepting your life as it has been, reconciling yourself to mortality, harvesting the wisdom of experience to offer those still growing. These are the gifts of the life cycle, the virtues that make a human life fully human. Erik Erikson gave us language for them, understanding of how they develop, hope that we might cultivate them more consciously. For this, we can be grateful as we let his words and ideas fade into dreams, as we release our hold on waking thought and surrender to sleep. The story is told. The life has been explored. The mind has been mapped. Now rest and let development continue in the darkness, in the quiet unfolding of the psyche's own wisdom, in the mysterious process by which we grow without trying, by which we become who we are across all the stages of a life. Good night, wanderer. Sleep well, grow gently, and know that you too are part of the great cycle of human becoming, part of the ancient pattern of trust and autonomy, identity and intimacy, generativity and integrity, the pattern that Erik Erikson spent his long life observing, describing, and finally embodying. All is well. Rest now.